In 1985, Steve Jobs walked away from Apple, the very company he had created less than a decade earlier. Employees watched from inside the building as the 30-year-old entrepreneur left, without knowing if he would ever return. Newspapers called it one of Silicon Valley's most shocking failures. To many people, the story was already over. But the real story had begun long before that moment. Almost 10 years earlier, in a quiet neighborhood in Los Altos, California, nothing seemed extraordinary. Tree-lined streets, modest homes, children riding bicycles, neighbors watering their lawns. It looked like thousands of other American suburbs. No one passing by could have imagined that one small garage would eventually reshape the modern world. Behind that ordinary garage door, two young men were building something that almost everyone believed was impossible. Steve Wozniak loved solving engineering problems with extraordinary precision. Steve Jobs saw something different. He wasn't fascinated by circuits alone. He imagined what those circuits could become if ordinary people were finally able to use them. The workspace was tiny. Shelves overflowed with spare parts, cables, notebooks, and unfinished prototypes. Every component was assembled by hand. Every mistake became another lesson. There were no investors, no corporate headquarters, and no certainty that any of it would work. Only curiosity, persistence, and an idea that refused to disappear. Even standing beside the unfinished Apple I, Jobs rarely looked at the machine itself. His attention was already fixed on a future that nobody else could yet see. Wozniak perfected the technology. Jobs imagined how technology could transform everyday life. Together, they formed a partnership that combined engineering with vision in a way the industry had never seen before. Outside that garage, however, computing belonged to giants. Massive mainframe systems filled entire rooms, operated by governments, universities, and large corporations. Computers were expensive, intimidating, and completely out of reach for ordinary families. For most people, owning one was as unrealistic as owning a private power plant. While the world believed computers would always remain behind locked doors, two friends kept working late into the night inside a suburban garage, quietly preparing the beginning of a completely different future. Night after night, the same small garage remained awake while the rest of the neighborhood slept. Coffee cups accumulated beside unfinished circuit boards, notebooks filled with new calculations, and the workbench slowly transformed into a place where persistence mattered more than comfort. Progress came in tiny steps, almost invisible from one day to the next, but together those small improvements began to form something extraordinary. Eventually, the Apple I was no longer just an idea. Resting on a simple wooden bench, it represented countless hours of trial, failure, and refinement. To anyone else, it looked like another handmade circuit board. To Steve Jobs, it was proof that personal computing could become real. The challenge, however, had only begun. Building one computer inside a garage was difficult enough. Building a company around it seemed almost impossible. Money was scarce. Tools were reused. Components were purchased one piece at a time whenever they could afford them. Every receipt, every invoice, and every dollar demanded careful decisions. Jobs understood that technical success meant nothing unless someone was willing to buy the product. The computer had to leave the garage and face the real world. Standing at the entrance of the garage, he looked across an ordinary suburban street. Nothing around him suggested he was about to challenge one of the largest industries in America. Yet he stepped forward anyway, carrying not only a computer, but a belief that the future could be different. Electronic stores were filled with radios, calculators, and stereo systems. Personal computers were almost non-existent because few people imagined they belonged in homes. Convincing someone to invest in an unknown machine built inside a suburban garage required more than engineering. It required conviction. The prototype had proven that the idea was possible. Now Steve Jobs faced an entirely different challenge, convincing complete strangers to believe in that idea before there was any evidence that it could ever become a business. Steve Jobs understood that building computers was only half the challenge. Before a single customer could receive an Apple I, he needed components, suppliers, and, above all, trust. Carrying nothing more than a purchase order and absolute confidence, he convinced experienced suppliers to take a chance on two young entrepreneurs with almost no money. They weren't investing in a successful company. They were investing in the possibility that one might exist. Back in the garage, the atmosphere changed overnight. The tiny workshop that had once been a place for experiments became an improvised factory. Every table was covered with components, soldering irons, and unfinished circuit boards. Friends joined the effort. Long days blended into even longer nights as every Apple I was assembled entirely by hand. Soon, the first completed computers left the garage and reached the shelves of the bite shop. Customers approached them with curiosity rather than certainty. Few understood exactly what personal computing would become, but many sensed they were looking at something different. For the first time, the idea of owning a computer no longer felt impossible. Inside the garage, stacks of finished machines slowly replaced scattered prototypes. Orders began to arrive. What had started as a hobby between two friends was becoming a real company. Yet Steve Jobs remained focused on the horizon rather than the success already surrounding him. Every milestone simply revealed a larger challenge waiting ahead. As Apple quietly gathered momentum, its reputation began spreading throughout Silicon Valley. Among the people paying attention was a young businessman named Mike Markkula. Unlike Jobs and Wozniak, Markkula had already achieved financial success. He understood engineering, but more importantly, he understood how companies were built. When he finally walked toward the modest garage in Los Altos, he wasn't searching for another investment. He was searching for the next great opportunity. From the outside, the building still looked completely ordinary. But after one conversation inside that garage, he realized he wasn't looking at a small electronics project. He was looking at the beginning of an industry. Mike Markkula's decision changed Apple's future in ways that went far beyond financial support. He invested his own money, but more importantly, he brought experience, discipline, and a clear business strategy. Apple was no longer just two brilliant friends building computers inside a garage. It was becoming a real company with a future. As the business took shape, Steve Jobs was already looking beyond the Apple I. The first computer had proven that ordinary people could own a computer. Now he wanted to create one they would actually want to use every day. The result was the Apple II. Unlike the intimidating machines that filled corporate computer rooms, this computer was designed for homes, schools, and small businesses. It arrived fully assembled, looked approachable, and invited people to interact with technology instead of fearing it. That philosophy represented a complete break from the industry's assumptions. For decades, computers had belonged to governments, universities, and large corporations. Apple imagined something radically different, a computer sitting on a family desk, helping children learn, supporting small businesses, and becoming part of everyday life. When the Apple II debuted at the West Coast Computer Fair in 1977, visitors immediately sensed that something had changed. Crowds gathered around the demonstration, fascinated by colorful graphics, an integrated keyboard, and a machine that felt remarkably simple to operate. It wasn't just another computer. It was the first one many people could genuinely picture bringing home. The elegant design reflected Steve Jobs' growing belief that technology should disappear into people's lives instead of demanding their attention. A computer should feel less like industrial equipment and more like an everyday tool. That simple idea transformed an entire industry. Personal computing no longer belonged behind locked doors or inside research laboratories. It began spreading quietly from one home to another, from classrooms to small businesses, changing the way millions of people would eventually work, learn, and communicate. The revolution had officially left the garage. By 1978, Apple had grown far beyond the small garage where it began. Assembly lines replaced workbenches, warehouses filled with computers waiting to be shipped, and employees worked around the clock to keep pace with demand. What had started as two friends building circuit boards by hand had become one of Silicon Valley's fastest-growing companies. The Apple II was no longer a curiosity. It had become an essential tool. Families welcomed it into their homes, while entrepreneurs discovered it could solve real business problems. The arrival of VisiCalc, the first successful spreadsheet program, changed everything. For thousands of business owners, buying an Apple II was no longer about exploring new technology. It became a practical financial decision. Instead of spending hours updating paper ledgers and performing calculations by hand, work that once consumed entire afternoons could now be completed in minutes. The software gave businesses a reason to purchase a personal computer, and for many customers, VisiCalc became the application that justified the investment. Demand accelerated rapidly. More computers left Apple's factories every week, shipments expanded across the country, and the company that had once struggled to afford electronic components was now producing machines on an industrial scale. Then, in December 1980, Apple reached another historic milestone. The company went public, creating one of the largest initial public offerings since Ford Motor Company decades earlier. Overnight, hundreds of employees became millionaires, and 25-year-old Steve Jobs became one of the youngest self-made millionaires in history. But success did not satisfy him. While financial markets celebrated Apple's extraordinary rise, Jobs spent his time inside product laboratories, surrounded by unfinished prototypes. Newspapers focused on the company's value. He focused on what came next. To Steve Jobs, every achievement represented only another starting point. Apple had transformed personal computing once already. Now he believed it could do it again. By the early 1980s, Apple had become one of the most influential technology companies in the world, yet Steve Jobs was already convinced that the Apple II represented the past. He wanted to build something far more revolutionary, a computer so intuitive that anyone could use it without technical knowledge. That vision led him to Xerox PARC, a research laboratory where engineers had quietly developed technologies decades ahead of their time. There, Jobs saw something that immediately changed the course of Apple: a graphical interface controlled by a small device called a mouse. Windows, icons, and direct interaction replaced the cryptic commands that had defined computing for years. Many visitors treated the demonstration as an interesting experiment. Jobs saw the future. He returned to Apple with a renewed sense of urgency. The Macintosh project became more than another product. It became a mission to make computers feel human. Engineers and designers worked with relentless intensity, often describing themselves as pirates, challenging the conventions of the entire industry. Every detail mattered, from the hardware to the software, because Jobs believed great products were created through complete integration. But as Apple's success continued to grow, so did the tension inside the company. The creativity that had fueled its rise increasingly collided with the demands of managing a rapidly expanding corporation. Seeking experienced leadership, Jobs recruited John Sculley from Pepsi, believing they would build Apple's future together. Instead, the partnership slowly unraveled. Strategic disagreements turned into personal conflict, and the board was eventually forced to choose between the company's visionary founder and the executive responsible for running it. In 1985, Steve Jobs walked away from the company he had built. For many observers, it looked like the end of an extraordinary story, but history would prove it was only the end of its first chapter. The man who left Apple in defeat would one day return, rescue the company from collapse, and transform it into the most valuable business the world had ever seen. Sometimes, the greatest comeback begins with the moment everyone else believes the story is over.